Welcome to CivilNet. My guest today is Watertown, Massachusetts-born, New York-based writer, novelist, Nancy Kricorian. Nancy, welcome. Thanks for joining us on CivilNet.
Well, thanks for having me.
I've wanted to do this for several weeks because I have your new book, All the Light There Was, and I wanted to ask you about its predecessors and its successor and all sorts of things. So thanks for this opportunity. Your first book, Zabel, was 15 years ago. And I remember reading it and thinking, finally, my story, parts of my story, are now on library shelves with everybody else's story. You did that at a time when there weren't many Armenian stories out there. What were the reactions? The reactions were really sort of twofold. From the Armenian community, it was a very warm reception, and then also, it had a nice reception just in the literary community at large. But it was really wonderful for me doing the book tour around the States, and then I ended up having some translation sales, and I did events, to support the Dutch translation of the book and also the German translation. And it was so funny to be in all these different cities and even in different countries and look out and see people who looked like, my family, the people who I had grown up with in my church and in the community in Watertown. And you continued, with Dreams of Bread and Fire? Right.
So the first book was a fictionalized account of my grandmother's story as an Armenian genocide survivor and immigrant bride, and mother in Watertown. And then the second one was about someone of my generation growing up sort of under the shadow of that heavy history of the genocide without ever having heard it articulated, in her childhood, but somehow absorbing the lessons of it. And then as a late adolescent, coming to terms with that part of her identity and figuring out what it meant to her. And then when I was researching that book, because I had a character in Dreams of Bread and Fire who was a Marxist, Leninist revolutionary who sets off a bomb, and I was doing a lot of research about what they call non-state actors using political violence. So I was reading about everything from, the Symbionese Liberation Army to the Red Army Brigade then I started reading about the French Resistance. And while I was reading about the French Resistance, I ended up seeing a documentary in 1984, a French documentary called Terrorists in Retirement, that was about a network, French Resistance network that was made up of immigrant workers and was headed by an Armenian named Misak Manusyan. And I had never come across this story before, and I sort of started looking into it, and I thought, I wondered what would it have been like for someone like Misak Manusyan, who was a genocide survivor, orphan genocide survivor, he made his way to France, he made his way from Marseille, where the refugee camp was, up to Paris, and sort of rebuilt his life. And what was it like for him and for other Armenians in Paris when, in 1940, the Nazis came marching into the city and they were living another war and experiencing an occupation? And I didn't want to write specifically about Misak Manusyan. There's been a lot written about him. I wanted to write about, from the point of view of a young Armenian girl in the community. And at the end of the first chapter, she says, "This is the story of how we lived the war and how I found my husband." Sort of that's the story that I, tell in the novel.
All the Light There Was, that is just very recently published, does something else that's kind of unusual. We all take for granted that Armenians are global, and yet what you've done is put this global people, this family, in the middle of world history, not specifically Armenian history. You've blended those two things really well. I don't know of other examples that do that for us, about us.
It's funny that there is a book that I came across that was given to me actually by Alice Arslanyan at the Samuelian bookstore in Paris when I went on a research trip to Paris, and I told her what I was interested in, and she said, "Oh, there's a book you have to read." And it was by a French author of Greek descent named Clément Lepidis, and he wrote a book called L'Arménien, and it was published, I think, in the early 50s or mid-50s.
And it was about an Armenian shoemaker, genocide survivor, who came to Paris, who came to Belleville, the neighborhood in which I set the novel, and was working in the shoe trade, which in the 20s and the 30s, the shoe trade in Paris, the fine, handmade, beautifully done shoes, the shoe trade was dominated by Greeks and Armenians in Belleville. And so there was this precedent of this, novel. Then that novel spanned from the late 20s until the late 40s, and it went through the war years as well. But yeah, it had, as far as I've seen, it hasn't been done, elsewhere.
You obviously know, they tell writers, write about what you know. So I guess if I ask you, why do you write these kinds of books, that could be an answer. But I wonder, is it because you've found some answers to things that you want to share? Are you still looking for answers for this, all over the world, multi-generational, traumatized people of ours?
Yeah, it's funny, I have started researching my next book, which is actually going to be about Armenians in Borj Hamoud during the Lebanese Civil War. And I was talking to my editor about it, and she said, this is your diaspora quartet, starting with Zabel and then the next two, and then this new one that I'm working on. And I think that I'm interested in the traumatic history on the one hand, but on the other hand, the sort of enormous sort of resilience of the Armenian people. And I'm not just interested in the sort of genocide narrative, but in the narrative of the diaspora. And the way that the image that keeps coming to my mind now as I'm working on this Beirut book is of birds, and which are very important in Armenian sort of literature and folklore and in proverbs and so on. This idea of the bird whose nest is destroyed, in fire or some kind of calamity, and then goes on to build a new nest. It flies someplace else and builds a new nest. And it's that kind of trajectory, that kind of resilience, that kind of strength that I'm interested in exploring in the books. And if you had to say, well, why would you choose this instead of writing about something else? My mother's family is French-Canadian. I'm half Armenian. But I grew up in Watertown in the community. And I guess it also has to do with, from a very young age, my sort of commitment to what I now call social justice. And I'm really interested in sort of telling this story that hasn't been told, and as a way to, as a way to right a wrong. And I still feel like compelled to do that for this, next book. I don't know what I'll do after my diaspora quartet, but for these 4 books, that's my commitment.
I would assume that given your commitment to social justice and the fact that the Lebanese Civil War clearly affected so many people beyond Armenians, that there will be other elements in the book. Yeah, I also, a few years ago, in 2010, I went on with the Egyptian-British writer Adaf Souef, organized this international writers to go to the West Bank, and this year they actually also went to Gaza. But to do what they call the Palestine Festival of Literature. And so with that trip, I traveled all through the West Bank and went to universities and cultural centers and met with students. And, that the Palestinian narrative is also an underrepresented story. And I think that will come in a little bit it informs what actually goes on in Beirut during the Civil War. So that will necessarily come in a little bit in the book. Other side of the book creation and publishing business question. There was a time when ethnic literature for young adults, for adults, was vogue, was chic, was in. Now with all of the financial pressures on the publishing industry, your publishers are with you, the books sell, you have an editor waiting for the 4th book, all of that is going well?
Yeah, it's fine. It feels different to me than it did 15 years ago. There's much more emphasis now on the writer doing a ton of work. Stuff that didn't happen to me the first time around, or when Dreams of Bread and Fire came out 10 years ago. But there's an expectation that you're on Twitter, that you're on Facebook, that you're doing all this, interfacing with people on social media, that you're going to be, writing articles on, and opinion pieces on spec and pitching them places. And it's interesting because review space has shrunk, you know, in the mainstream newspapers. But then there's all these bloggers now. There's all these literary bloggers. So there's a kind of shift in the way that, you know, selling your books is done. And I was joking with my mother. I was saying I feel a little bit like, you know, I'm selling Girl Scout cookies door to door. It's like hand-to-hand combat, house-to-house combat, you know, trying to sell your books. But that's what it's, I mean, I talk to other writers, and that's sort of where it is right now. I mean, I even look at somebody like my friend Chris Bojalian, who, you know, gets books on the New York Times bestseller list, and when I see the sheer volume, you know, amount of work he's doing, the planes that he's on, you know, I see his Twitter feed, I see his Facebook posts, and we're all, like, working really hard.
With you, is the Armenian community pulling its weight?
Yeah, I have to say it's been very supportive, and particularly this time, for some reason, you know, different times, different organizations or groups come forward, and this time I've really felt a lot of love and a lot of support from the AGBU and from AWA, from the Armenian International Women's Association. Both of those groups have, you know, AGBU flew me up to Toronto, they flew me up to Montreal to do events there, and AWA organized a really lovely event for me in San Francisco, and there's one that we're setting up now for the fall in New Jersey, and I really appreciate the support.
We appreciate your efforts to take individual stories and make them global. So thank you for your work, and thank you for joining us on CivilNet.
Well, thank you for your interest.
And thank you for following us on CivilNet.